Movie franchise video games on the consoles are very popular, but they never really had a huge partaking in the arcade scene. One game that was very popular and based on a movie franchise was the Terminator 2 arcade game. Let's check it out. Arcade gun-based shooters have always been highly successful in the arcade. Operation Wolf, Time Crisis, House of the Dead, Lethal Enforcers, and many more are some examples of this. If we go back to the year 1991, not only will we find an awesome gun-based shooter, but one that would be based on a highly successful and popular movie title. Terminator 2 Judgment Day, released by Midway, was one of the earliest, if not the first, of its kind to bring an established franchise to the gun-based shooter genre. While there were tons of arcade games released prior to feature licensed franchises, no one had ever turned one into a gun-based shooter where you exclusively use a gun for your controls. So let's start off this review and take a look at what the arcade unit looked like. The unit featured side art showcasing the Governor himself, Arnie, on both sides. The control panel featured two Uzi-like guns mounted for two-player simultaneous action. The control panel also featured a picture of the T-1000 with some basic artwork, game info, and instructions on it. The guns on this control panel are actually not light gun based, as one might suspect. They are actually controlled by two analog pentometers. One of these pots controlled the up and down movement, while the other controlled the left and right. So technically, the guns at their core are analog controllers. For space and depth reasons, Midway decided to mount the monitor in the unit flat on its back and invert the graphics. They then mounted a mirror in the unit to show the game's images to the player upright and correctly oriented. The cabinet also incorporated LED lights for each player that were positioned behind colored gels shaped like mini explosions. These LEDs blinked when your player was taking damage, which was a pretty cool effect. The game has players taking control of Arnold's T-800 model as he starts in his quest to protect John Connor. The beginning of the game is kind of like a prequel to Terminator 2, as you start your game in the future battling Skynet. Here you are trying to get to the Skynet mainframe, where you can use a time machine to take you back in time, so you can protect John Connor from the T-1000 that Skynet sent. After you beat a number of these future stages and get to the time machine, the player will visit some of the film's more memorable scenes, like the Cyberdyne building bombing, the helicopter chase scene, and the steel mill. Gameplay was your standard left-to-right progression shooting game. You have your primary machine gun fire, as well as a secondary missile launcher that the player needs to replenish ammo for. The player's machine gun has a varied power level meter. The longer you keep your finger on the trigger, the lower the meter will go, and the slower your gun will shoot. The player must either wait a few seconds for the gun to return to full speed, or pick up new ammo clips or these trigger thingamabobs. Some ammo clips even upgrade your gun to a more powerful weapon, and other pickups change your missile launcher to a multi-missile launcher or a shotgun. The game is filled with a number of different enemies, like Terminators, droids, SWAT teams, and some pretty impressive bosses. In most gun-based shooters, really there are only a handful of objects and enemies that approach the player from a distance and move toward them. In Terminator 2, there just seems to be a lot more enemies that do this, which was pretty impressive for the time. It's not uncommon to see actual enemies like the T-800s and drones appear at a distance and come closer to the player. As you can see, the game's graphics are pretty impressive for the time. Not only were in-game sprites clean and detailed, but the title also incorporated real digitized images of the movie's characters, such as the human rebels, Arnie's T-800, the T-1000, and Sarah and John Connor, just to name a few. A number of the real actors were actually used in the game. Eddie Furlong is credited as being in the game, as well as Arnold, though another person is actually credited as playing the Terminator. You can see that Arnold's sprite is a little off, so I'm going to say that a double is used for him. Robert Patrick is definitely playing the T-1000 in this game, but Linda Hamilton did not play Sarah Connor. Apparently a double was used. I actually had a chance to meet Linda Hamilton a while back, and I had asked her if she was ever approached about being in the Terminator 2 game. Unfortunately, she said she never was. The sound of the game was very well done. Explosions, gunfire, real-life digital sound effects, and voice samples from Schwarzenegger and Patrick were used to give the player a truly authentic experience. In-game music is a mixed mash of music inspired from the film and others that really don't sound like anything from the movie. That's not to say, however, it's bad. It's just different. A pretty impressive feat accomplished by this game was each stage's high level of destructive environments. Crates, lights, walls, fire extinguishers, and more were destructible, and players were awarded points for shooting them. The game even had an entire level dedicated to doing just this in the Cyberdyne laboratory stage. Here you have to destroy every piece of computer tech in the stage in order to prevent Skynet from being created. Depending if you are able to accomplish this or not will alter the ending of the game slightly. The game's difficulty is pretty high in my opinion. There is no way anyone could beat this game with the 50 or 75 cents that arcade owners were charging to play the game. To be honest, I would be pretty impressed if someone can beat it under $15. Now the number one complaint I hear about this game is that it's very repetitious, as they're basically just shooting everything all of the time. To that I say, well, yeah, but that is what these types of shooters are all about. Quick, mindless, fun action. T2 tried to vary up this formula a tad by making the player protect vehicles such as John Connor's truck, as well as the stolen SWAT van they obtained. Both of these stages are actually really tough and kind of make the game a little frustrating due to their difficulty. Oh, and as a side note, I never understood why the helicopter ramming the SWAT van would make it explode, when in the movie Arnold purposely slams on the brakes to destroy the helicopter. In the end though, you just have to realize it's just a video game. Now the two major console ports of the game were the SNES and Genesis. The first thing I want to say about them is that their official name was changed from Terminator 2 Judgment Day to T2 the arcade game. The SNES port featured the look of the arcade game, however scaled down a bit. Enemies appear to be a bit smaller than the arcade port, the digitized characters are a bit less clear, and there are some frames of animation missing. The sound is a little compressed but pretty accurate, but there do appear to be a number of digital voice recordings from Arnold that appear to be missing. The big hype for the SNES version was that it supported the Super Scope 6, but if you ever play the game with it, you know you're better off just using the regular controller. Using that damn Super Scope eyepiece for review is way too constrictive. This version of the game, while definitely inferior when compared to the arcade game, is in my opinion the best port available of the game. Now the best way I can describe the Genesis version is saying, okay. The game is just a little weird looking at first glance. It was also very actively promoted to be compatible with Sega's Miniature Light Gun. Again though, you're better off playing with the controller in my opinion. It looks like none of the original sprites, backgrounds, or digitized imagery was used from the arcade game at all. Instead, it looks like Probe, who ported the game, had to create all new sprites for the port due to the Genesis's inability to support the arcade game sprites. Two examples of what I'll call the re-envisioning of the game are the Resistance soldiers, who now look all the same and more infantry soldier looking, and the previously digitized, now completely hand-drawn sprite of the Arnold enemy Terminator, who actually doesn't look too bad. I can't really say that for the further away sprite they used of him, as he kinda looks like one of the members of the Village People. You can really tell that the Genesis color palette is what really held the game back from getting a more authentic port, especially in the first stage where the whole stage is pretty much completely comprised of blue and red. The sound effects in this port are pretty forgettable, and pretty much no music from the original game was used. Again, this was probably due to the Genesis lacking in the hardware department. Instead, we are left with this kooky music that just makes you want to dance. Well, maybe not. The game was also ported to the Amiga, Game Gear, DOS, Master System, and Game Boy, but I really don't want to go into those because they weren't the greatest ports. So there you have it, Terminator 2 Judgment Day for the arcades. A game that not only proved that a licensed franchise would work in the gun-based shooter genre, but that it could bring ingenuity and new innovations to the genre as well. It proved this with its overwhelming popularity and fairly long lifespan in the arcades. It is, in my opinion, not only one of the best gun-based shooters of the early 90s, but one of the best ever made.